vanished piper. Ellie sat at her desk in the small research office, the room illuminated by the dim glow of a single desk lamp. Her hands trembled as she flipped through a brittle journal, the old parchment crackling beneath her fingers. She had spent the last few hours poring over accounts of Edinburgh Castle's underground tunnels, her mind still reeling from the near collapse of the vaults. "You've been at that for hours," Callum said from the couch, his voice thick with fatigue. "Tell me you're finding something useful." Ellie didn't look up. "I think I've found a connection," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. Callum raised an eyebrow. "Another curse? A secret passage to hell? Or maybe just a ghost or two for good measure?" Ellie smirked faintly, but ignored his sarcasm. She tapped a passage in the journal and turned it toward him. "The Piper." Callum frowned as he leaned forward, his eyes scanning the faded text. "The one who disappeared in the tunnels." Ellie nodded. According to legend, centuries ago, a young piper volunteered to explore the castle's underground passages. He was tasked with determining if they connected to the nearby Royal Mile. He played his bagpipes as he went, so those on the surface could track his progress. But then the music stopped, and they never found him. Callum finished, his voice softer now. "Exactly," Ellie said. "He vanished without a trace. Some say the tunnels collapsed. Others claim he was taken by something lurking below. But the legend doesn't end there." Callum leaned back, his skepticism replaced by curiosity. "Let me guess. He's still down there?" Ellie nodded, her expression grim. "People have reported hearing bagpipes coming from the tunnels, especially after major events or before disasters. The ghostly music is said to be his lament, warning others not to follow where he went." The piper's legacy. Ellie delved further into the journal, reading aloud passages that described the piper's legend. The author, a historian from the 1800s, had collected first-hand accounts from locals who claimed to have heard the music. One account from 1823 describes a merchant who was walking near the castle after dark. Ellie said he heard faint bagpipes coming from beneath his feet. When he stopped to listen, the sound grew louder, almost desperate, before suddenly cutting off. Callum shivered. "I'd have run the other way." Ellie gave him a sidelong glance. "You probably would have tried to bargain with the ghost." He chuckled nervously, but the humor quickly faded as Ellie continued. "Here's another one from 1935. A soldier stationed at the castle heard the bagpipes while on patrol near the tunnels. He followed the sound, but as he got closer, the ground beneath him started to shake. He barely escaped before the tunnel collapsed." Callum frowned. "So, the piper's warning people away from the tunnels. Or something's keeping people from finding him," Ellie said. "The call of the pipes." Ellie and Callum ventured back to the castle grounds that evening, armed with flashlights and a crude map of the tunnels. The entrance to the underground passages was marked by a heavy iron grate near the castle's edge, partially obscured by overgrown ivy and moss. Ellie knelt beside the grate, brushing away the vegetation. "This is where the piper supposedly started," she said, her voice low. Callum shone his flashlight into the darkness beyond the grate, the beam revealing a narrow stone staircase leading downward. "I really hate this plan," he muttered. Ellie gave him a faint smile. "You can wait up here if you want." "Not a chance," Callum said, though his tone suggested he wished otherwise. The grate creaked loudly as they pried it open, the sound echoing ominously. Ellie descended first, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the faint, metallic tang of damp stone and earth. "Do you hear that?" Ellie asked, pausing mid-step. Callum stopped behind her, his flashlight illuminating the staircase. "Hear what?" Ellie listened intently, her heart pounding. Faintly, almost imperceptibly, came the sound of bagpipes, soft, mournful, and distant. Callum's face paled. "That's not funny. I'm not joking," Ellie said, her voice trembling. The descent into the tunnels. The sound grew louder as they descended, its haunting melody filling the narrow passage. Ellie's chest tightened as the music seemed to wrap around her, the notes tugging at something deep within her soul. "It's him," Ellie whispered. "The piper." Callum swallowed hard, Maybe it's just the wind, or... Bagpipes don't sound like the wind, Ellie said sharply, cutting him off. At the bottom of the staircase, the passage opened into a narrow tunnel carved into the bedrock. The walls were damp, their surfaces etched, with faint markings that Ellie couldn't decipher. The bagpipes echoed faintly now, their melody weaving through the darkness like a thread. "Which way?" Callum asked, his voice tight. Ellie consulted the map, though the markings were crude and incomplete. "This way," she said, pointing to the left. The tunnel sloped downward, its uneven floor littered with debris. Ellie's flashlight caught glimpses of rusted metal and scraps of decayed wood, remnants of long-abandoned attempts to reinforce the passage. The bagpipes grew louder, their mournful tune carrying a sense of urgency. Ellie quickened her pace, her pulse racing as the melody seemed to guide her deeper into the tunnels. The Piper's Lament. They reached a wide chamber where the tunnel branched into 3 paths. The bagpipes were louder here, their sound reverberating off the walls in an almost physical way. Ellie paused, her flashlight sweeping across the chamber. "Do you feel that?" she asked. Callum nodded, his expression tense. "It's like the air's vibrating." The music shifted suddenly, the melody becoming sharper, more frantic. Ellie's breath caught as the sound seemed to come from all directions at once, wrapping around them like an invisible force. "We're not alone," Callum said, his voice barely audible. Ellie turned toward one of the tunnels, her flashlight illuminating the faint outline of a figure in the shadows. The figure was small and indistinct, its form flickering like a flame. "Do you see that?" Ellie asked. Callum nodded, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Is it?" The figure stepped forward, revealing the faint outline of a man in traditional Highland dress. He held a set of bagpipes, his hands moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Ellie's chest tightened as she took a cautious step closer. "Are you the piper?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the music grew louder, the notes filled with sorrow and longing. The warning. As Ellie approached, the piper raised his head, revealing hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The music stopped abruptly, and the chamber fell into a heavy silence. The piper raised a hand, pointing toward one of the tunnels. Ellie's flashlight beam followed the gesture, illuminating a section of the passage that appeared to have collapsed. "What's down there?" Callum asked, his voice tight with fear. Ellie turned back to the piper, but the figure had vanished, leaving only a faint echo of the bagpipes behind. "They sealed it," Ellie said softly. "Whatever happened to him, it's connected to that tunnel." Callum shook his head. "You're not seriously thinking about going in there?" Ellie nodded, her jaw set with determination. "We have to." He was trying to warn us. The sealed passage. As they approached the collapsed tunnel, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, faint and mournful. Ellie's flashlight illuminated a section of the rubble, revealing faint carvings etched into the stone. "These symbols," Ellie said, brushing away the dust. "They're the same as the ones on the artifact." Callum frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the piper found something," Ellie said. "Something they didn't want anyone else to see." The ground beneath them trembled slightly, and the whispers grew louder, their cadence rising like a chant. "We need to leave," Callum said, his voice urgent. "Not yet," Ellie said, her fingers tracing the carvings. "This is the key to everything." The whispers swelled, and Ellie felt the weight of the piper's warning pressing down on her. The tunnels held secrets, secrets that were desperate to be uncovered but dangerous to reveal. The haunting melody. The tunnels beneath Edinburgh Castle stretched endlessly into the darkness, their damp walls echoing with the faint drip of water and the muted shuffle of Ellie and Callum's cautious steps. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and an oppressive stillness wrapped around them like a shroud. But then, faintly at first, came the sound. A melody, ghostly and ethereal, drifted through the tunnels. It was faint, as though played from a great distance, but unmistakably the mournful wail of bagpipes. The notes carried a strange weight, each one resonating in Ellie's chest like a heartbeat. "Do you hear that?" Ellie whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and awe. Callum, walking a few paces behind her, stopped abruptly. "I hear it," he said, his voice trembling. "But I really wish I didn't." Ellie's flashlight swept across the walls, her beam catching glimpses of faint carvings and worn stones. "It's him," she said, her breath hitching. "The piper." Callum groaned. "Great! A ghost musician leading us deeper into a death trap. Fantastic plan, Ellie." But she wasn't listening. The melody had taken on a life of its own, winding through the tunnels like a living thing. It seemed to beckon her, pulling her forward with an invisible tether. The pull of the music. The melody grew louder as they continued, its haunting beauty filling the air. The notes were deliberate, each one infused with sorrow and longing. Ellie felt her chest tighten as she listened, the music stirring something deep within her, a strange mixture of sadness and curiosity. "It's so sad," she said, her voice barely audible. Callum snorted nervously. "It's creepy, Ellie. Not sad. Creepy." But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the music wasn't meant to frighten them. It felt more like a message, a call for help echoing across centuries. The tunnel sloped downward, and the floor grew slick with moisture. Ellie steadied herself against the wall as the melody seemed to wrap around her, growing louder and more insistent. "We're getting closer," she said, her pace quickening. "Closer to what?" Callum asked, his voice rising with panic. "The source of this nightmare." Ellie ignored him, her attention fixed on the music. The catacombs. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, its walls lined with niches that held crumbling bones and tattered scraps of fabric. The air was colder here, and Ellie's breath came out in visible puffs. "This is it," she said, her flashlight illuminating the chamber. The melody seemed to fill the room, resonating off the walls and creating an almost tangible presence. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the sound was coming from beyond the chamber, from a narrow passage at the far end. "Ellie," Callum said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to think about this. If the Piper's legend is true, he disappeared down here for a reason." Ellie turned to him, her expression resolute. "And if he's still here, he's trying to show us something. We have to follow it." Callum shook his head but didn't argue. "Fine, but if we get trapped down here, I'm haunting you in the afterlife." The melody intensifies. The passage narrowed as they moved deeper, forcing Ellie and Callum to walk single file. The bagpipes' melody grew louder, the notes sharp and deliberate, as though urging them onward. Ellie's flashlight illuminated strange carvings on the walls, symbols and runes she couldn't decipher. They seemed to pulse faintly in the light, their patterns almost hypnotic. "What do you think these mean?" she asked, brushing her fingers over the carvings. "I think they mean we should turn back," Callum replied, his voice tense. Ellie ignored him, her mind racing with possibilities. The carvings felt significant, as though they were part of the puzzle the Piper was leading them to solve. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and a low, rumbling noise echoed through the tunnel. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and Ellie stumbled, catching herself against the wall. "What was that?" Callum asked, his voice tight with fear. Ellie's heart raced. "I don't know, but we need to keep moving." The heart of the catacombs. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller but more ornate than the last. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, and the floor was inlaid with a circular pattern that seemed to radiate outward like ripples in water. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface cracked and worn with age. On it rested a set of bagpipes, their once bright tartan faded to a dull, ghostly hue. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "It's him," she whispered. The bagpipes seemed to hum faintly, their presence filling the room with an unearthly energy. The melody had stopped now, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on Ellie and Callum like a weight. "This isn't possible," Callum said, his voice shaking. Ellie stepped forward, her flashlight illuminating the pedestal. The bagpipes were old but intact, their pipes polished to a faint sheen. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers hovering just above the instrument. As her hand made contact, the air around them exploded with sound. The bagpipes emitted a single, mournful note that reverberated through the chamber, and the carvings on the walls flared to life, their symbols glowing with an otherworldly light. The piper appears. A figure materialized at the far end of the room, its form flickering like a flame. It was the piper, his ghostly outline clad in traditional Highland dress, his face obscured by shadow. Ellie froze, her heart pounding. "Are you him?" The piper raised his head, revealing hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The room filled with whispers, their cadence rhythmic and mournful, echoing the melody of the bagpipes. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine as the piper raised a hand, pointing toward the carvings on the walls. "What does it mean?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. The piper didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer to the pedestal, his form flickering as though caught between worlds. Ellie's flashlight flickered, and the room grew colder. The whispers intensified, their tone shifting from sorrow to urgency. "He's trying to tell us something," Ellie said. "Or warn us," Callum muttered. The message. As the whispers reached a fever pitch, the symbols on the walls began to move, their patterns shifting and realigning. Ellie's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the message. "The carvings," she said, her voice filled with realization. "They're a map. They're showing us the way out." The piper nodded once, his hollow eyes locked on Ellie's. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, his form dissolved into the air, leaving only the faint echo of his music behind. Callum exhaled shakily. "I can't believe we just saw that." Ellie turned to him, her expression resolute. "We have to follow the map. Whatever's down here, it's not over yet." The piper's grim fate. The chamber grew unnaturally still as the piper's ghostly form dissolved into the air. Ellie stood frozen, her hand hovering near the pedestal where the spectral bagpipes had rested moments before. The whispers that had accompanied his presence faded into silence, leaving a heavy, expectant hush that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Callum broke the stillness first, his voice tight with fear. "Ellie, I think we should leave. Whatever this is, it's beyond us." But Ellie's gaze remained fixed on the pedestal, the carvings on the walls, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light, seemed to pulse with a hidden message. The piper's appearance, his mournful melody, and the haunting glow of the runes all pointed to something important. "I can feel it," she murmured. "He's trying to tell us something. That's exactly why we should go," Callum said, his voice rising. "Ghosts don't appear to give pep talks, Ellie. They show up to warn us, and usually for a good reason." Ellie ignored him, her instincts compelling her to step closer to the pedestal. The moment her hand brushed the cold stone, the chamber seemed to shift. The vision begins. Ellie's breath hitched as her surroundings dissolved, the chamber replaced by a swirling haze of shadows and light. She felt weightless, suspended in an otherworldly void where time and space seemed to blur. Then the vision came. She was standing in the tunnels, but they weren't the same as before. They were pristine, their walls smooth and unmarked by the centuries of decay she had seen earlier. Torches lined the passage, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows. And there he was, the piper. Ellie watched as the young man, clad in traditional Highland attire, walked confidently through the tunnel. His bagpipes rested under one arm, and he played a jaunty tune that echoed cheerfully through the stone corridors. There was no fear in his movements, only curiosity and determination. As he played, Ellie noticed something strange. The further he walked, the more distorted the tune became. The notes grew sharp and discordant, the melody unraveling into a chaotic jumble of sound. The piper hesitated, his steps faltering. He looked around, his confident demeanor replaced by unease. "Turn back," Ellie whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. The descent into horror. The vision shifted, the torches dimming as an unnatural darkness crept into the tunnel. The piper's footsteps echoed loudly now, the sound magnified in the oppressive silence. His playing stopped abruptly, and he clutched his bagpipes tightly, his breathing ragged. Ellie's heart ached as she watched him, He wasn't much older than she was, his youthful face etched with mounting fear. The darkness seemed alive, pulsating like a living thing as it closed in around him. The piper turned suddenly, as though hearing something behind him. Ellie strained to listen, and faintly, she heard it too. A deep, guttural growl that resonated through the tunnel like a distant thunderstorm. The piper broke into a run, his bagpipes clutched tightly to his chest. Ellie followed, though she knew she was only a phantom in the vision, unable to intervene. The tunnel sloped downward, and the piper stumbled, his frantic breaths echoing around them. The growling grew louder, closer, and Ellie caught glimpses of something moving in the shadows, a massive, indistinct form that seemed to writhe and shift as it pursued him. The final stand. The piper reached a dead end, the tunnel narrowing to a solid wall of stone. He spun around, his back pressed against the cold surface as the darkness closed in. His bagpipes slipped from his grasp, the sound of them striking the floor echoing like a death knell. "No," Ellie whispered, tears stinging her eyes. The piper raised his hands, as though trying to ward off the encroaching darkness. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear. Then, with a final, defiant cry, he reached for his bagpipes and played a single, mournful note. The sound reverberated through the tunnel, cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. The darkness recoiled slightly, its form writhing as though in pain. But it wasn't enough. The piper's form flickered and dissolved, consumed by the shadows. The bagpipes fell silent, their mournful echo lingering for only a moment before fading completely. A warning delivered. Ellie gasped as the vision ended, her surroundings snapping back into focus. She was back in the chamber, her hand still resting on the pedestal. Callum stood a few feet away, his face pale and his eyes wide with concern. "Ellie," he said, his voice trembling. "What happened? You were just standing there, not moving." Ellie staggered back from the pedestal, her chest heaving as she tried to process what she had seen. "I saw him," she said, her voice shaking. "The piper. I saw what happened to him." Callum stepped closer, his expression tense. "What did you see?" Ellie met his gaze, her eyes filled with fear. He was taken by something in the tunnels, something dark and alive. It consumed him. Callum cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "And now it's after us, isn't it?" Ellie didn't answer. She turned toward the carvings on the walls, her mind racing. The piper's vision wasn't just a glimpse of the past. It was a warning. The shadow lurks. As Ellie and Callum prepared to leave the chamber, the air grew colder, and a faint rumbling echoed through the tunnels. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. "We need to move," Callum said, his voice urgent. Ellie nodded, clutching her flashlight as they made their way back toward the main passage. The tunnel seemed darker than before, the light from their flashlights barely penetrating the oppressive gloom. The melody of the bagpipes returned, faint and broken, as though played by a trembling hand. Ellie's chest tightened as the sound wrapped around her, filling her with both sorrow and dread. "It's him," she said, her voice trembling. "No," Callum said sharply. "It's not him. Not anymore." The growling sound from Ellie's vision echoed through the tunnel, low and menacing. Ellie's blood ran cold as she realized they weren't alone. A narrow escape. The growling grew louder, reverberating through the stone walls. Ellie quickened her pace, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she navigated the uneven ground. Callum was close behind her, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. A shadow moved in the corner of Ellie's vision, large, indistinct, and impossibly fast. She turned her flashlight toward it, but the beam revealed only empty space. "We're not going to make it," Callum muttered, his voice filled with fear. "Yes, we will," Ellie said, though her own voice wavered. They rounded a corner, just as the tunnel behind them began to collapse. The sound of crumbling stone filled the air, and Ellie felt a rush of cold wind as the darkness surged toward them. "Run," she shouted, grabbing Callum's arm. The tunnel sloped upward, and Ellie could see the faint glimmer of daylight ahead. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning as she sprinted toward the exit. They burst into the open air, just as the ground beneath them trembled violently. Ellie stumbled and fell to her knees, gasping for breath as the sound of the collapse echoed behind her. The Piper's legacy. Ellie turned to look at the tunnel's entrance, now buried beneath tons of rubble. The whispers had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. Callum sank to the ground beside her, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "Tell me we're done," he said, his voice hollow. Ellie didn't answer. Her mind was still racing, her thoughts consumed by the vision of the Piper's fate. "He tried to warn us," she said softly. "But whatever's down there, it's not finished." Callum groaned, running a hand over his face. "Of course it's not." Ellie's gaze shifted to the castle looming above them, its dark silhouette a reminder of the secrets still hidden within its walls. "The Piper's story isn't over," she said, "and neither is ours."